This is about your first literature exam, the Shakespeare part of the paper, and the second Shakespeare essay. So not the first essay, the second essay. I thought I'd talk you through some of the main things you've got to remember. You haven't done this exam for a little while, so just a chance to revise and think how we approach that. The way I'm going to do that today is take one of the key speeches that we've given you to revise and talk through it in quite a bit of detail. Let's look at the essay question. It's a theme question, so in this case it's conflict that we need to write about. As we go through and analyse this speech, we're going to be thinking about conflict in particular. And the word elsewhere there is just to remind you, in Shakespeare you have to write two pieces in the exam. The first piece you're given the extract. In your practice essay, for example, it was Act 2, Scene 2, the murder scene, and you have to analyse the language and how Shakespeare produces an effect with the language. In this essay, you don't do that. You can choose anywhere else in the text to write about, multiple places, but you cannot mention the extract you're given in the first written piece in the exam. So the first section of the exam, do not use quotes from that section. Some other themes that could quite often come up, that have come up. First one was predictions, how predictions are important, tensions, disagreements, nature. If you go online and look at themes in Macbeth, any of those could come up, and any variations of those themes could quite well come up. So get to know those scenes and speeches, and coming back to our 5 main speeches that you should really know well and have plenty of notes and annotations on. Act 3, Scene 1 is the one we're going to look at. The things I want to do here are just to put the speech in the context of the play, so we can just remember where does this fit in, and knowing where it fits in will help us in our analysis, but also the socio-historical context, and just reminding us of those major themes that we could write about to show that we understand the context of the play. The structure of the speech I think is very important. In most of the big speeches that's the case, so we'll look at that, and identify some useful quotes to explore. We can't get around the fact that memory is going to be important in this essay. The more quotes you can remember, or the more good quotes you can remember, the more you've got those in your mind to play with as you're preparing your essay. And let's explore the ideas and themes, obviously, that come through, because we need to be able to write about those. And then towards the end, I want to do a little bit of paragraph writing, so you can see an example of a paragraph, and you can practice some of your own writing. I think if you can show a good understanding of where the speech comes in the play, how it fits in, how it connects to the other places in the play, that shows a good understanding of the text as a whole, which is one of the things you're getting marked on. So if you can find ways to sneak these comments into your essay, of course we don't want to be doing plot summary through your whole essay, but just you can be aware of these things as you write. First one is, there is a bit of a gap between the end of Act 2 and the beginning of Act 3, and we haven't been close with Macbeth for a while. I think it was Act 2, Scene 1, where we get a last sort of soliloquy with Macbeth. And in this scene, he's now king. We get a chance to catch up with him now that he's achieved his goals. And you'd assume he'd be really happy and have a sense of achievement. The plan's worked. He's king. He should be very secure, celebrating. But of course he's not at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So that's a real significant point here, that he is king. Don't forget also on stage, he'd have the robes, he'd have the crown, he'd have the people around him, and the staging would all indicate he's now the new Duncan. Don't forget they used to spend more money on the costumes than they did on the actors during this time. So definitely something that the audience are very aware of. Macbeth is now the new king. As part of that, he's got lots of power and money, and we see at the beginning of Act 3, Scene 1, he's given commands, he's giving clear instructions to everyone. They've got a celebratory feast in the afternoon. He's speaking about himself as very much the ruler, in public anyway. Also, I think there's a few things that we'd be suspicious about, or sharp audience members should be suspicious about. Macbeth's asked several quite dodgy questions in relation to Banquo. Where are you going this afternoon? How long are you going to be away for? Are you going very far? and is your son going with you? So alarm bells should really be starting to ring immediately before this speech occurs, and that I think would have audiences just listening very carefully as to what Macbeth has to say after he's achieved this goal, now that he's on his own. Don't forget also the socio-historical points of Jacobean society. You've got lots of notes on these, but just be aware that every time we talk about what Macbeth's done to become king, be aware that this is regicide and it's going against God. It's an act of blasphemy. It's not just betraying your ruler or being a traitor. It's absolutely going against God. So just be aware of that. Macbeth has followed the advice of devil-worshipping witches there. So again, the supernatural influence. Again, you can't get worse than killing the king, and doing so on the advice of witches. I mean, it's a really, really awful thing that Macbeth's done. So just always acknowledge that. Don't forget also Macbeth is a feudal leader now. So all the rulers of the lands owe him their allegiance and owe him their soldiers and owe him their tax money. So he's a very, very powerful person here in Scotland. Let's not forget also James I, the king, who Shakespeare had in mind when he was writing this play, is Scottish, had a relative called Banquo, and there's a very close tie between the character of Banquo, and Banquo is a key part of the speech, and James I. So when he talks about Banquo's royalty of nature in this speech, we can assume Shakespeare was really had James in mind there. Don't forget also, I think this is a really underrated point. This play is a tragedy, and Shakespearean audiences would have been very aware that this was a tragedy, and they would have been very sensitive to a genre. Just like you guys go to your romantic movies, and you know that the couple are going to be getting together at the end of the movie. There's going to be a reason why they're not getting together in the middle. They're very, very aware of this genre, so they would have known that Macbeth is going to die at the end of this play. They would have known that he had a fatal flaw, and that there would be a moral lesson in the play. So they'd be looking out for those things, even though they'd like Macbeth, and that's part of the skill of writing a good tragedy. They're still very aware that actually things are not going to be happy here. Things are going to start to deteriorate. And also, I've just got a comment there about the early modern sort of great chain of being. Don't forget that if you do something like killing the king and committing regicide, things will not be right. So if you commit a horrible crime, things will be massively disturbed. We saw that at the very beginning in Act 1, Scene 1. We get our thunder, we get our lightning, we get our storms, we get our battles, because MacDonald and Cawdor have gone against the king. So let's just remember that the audiences would have been aware of this. Here is the speech that we're going to spend time going through. I really, really recommend that you should have a copy of the speech in your books, probably on a double-page spread. It could be written out by hand, that can help you remember it, or you could print it off and glue that into your books, but it should be heavily annotated. And you should have key quotes from the speech highlighted, key words, key quotes that you can start remembering, and those should find their way onto flashcards as well. I think if you were going to spend 2 paragraphs writing about the speech and analysing the speech and what it reveals about a theme in your exam, you should say have 3 to 4 quotes per paragraph. So if you can remember 8 really useful phrases or expressions from the speech, that's a great starting point. And if you could know that for 4 or 5 of these key speeches, you'd be in a really good position as you head into the exam. It's actually not that difficult to remember those quotes. You probably already know several of the quotes from the speech without even trying. So do make sure you've got a copy in your books. Today we'll be working from this. I've got it all on the slides, but I do recommend having a copy in your text, and we'll probably be doing a few activities based on this extract. So for you to perform those activities, you should have the text in front of you. Before we look at specific language in each of the sections of the speech, I just thought I'd talk about 3 structural features, just looking at the whole thing. The first one is to do with what comes at the start and the end of the speech. It's very much bookended by the arrival of those men mentioned in the red there at the top, and the two murderers who arrive at the end, who are those men. So as soon as Shakespeare's put this in front of the speech, it very much is a structural device which builds suspense. We don't know who they are. It's quite a mysterious comment. Are those men here? Can you send them in, please? It really makes us curious as to what's happened. It does tell us, once we figure out they're murderers, it does tell us that Macbeth's already made these decisions. So in some ways he's filling us in as to why he's made these decisions, where these decisions come from. And then, of course, as soon as they arrive, he starts to plan to murder Banquo. So I think the fact that this comes at the beginning of the speech and at the end of the speech is quite significant. Second structural feature is the fact that this is a soliloquy. You guys know a lot about soliloquies, and the great thing for you is you don't need to remember many quotes for this. It's just your general knowledge about the effect here and just apply it to the scene. The fact that we've got a stage direction that the attendant exits and that Macbeth is on his own on stage is quite significant. You guys went to Othello and you've seen this moment where we have in Othello as Iago often and at times Othello himself. And you'll remember that's a very intimate scene. It's one actor alone on stage looking at us, speaking to us, the hundreds of people that are in the theatre. And it very much is, there's no distraction, there's complete connection between us and him. And it's quite an intimate moment, and it's a very sort of special time where we hear his thoughts, and it's very personal. And I think the other thing to remember with a soliloquy is that there's no one else on stage for the character to be acting up to. So the only person that they're trying to put an act on is for themselves in some way. And I think you could argue that Macbeth is not being honest with himself here as he goes through and thinks about Banquo. But that's something to bear in mind, that the audience are there, the actors speaking straight to the audience. It's also significant if we compare it to the other soliloquies in the play. If we look at the soliloquies in Act 1 and Act 2, for example, if it were done when 'tis done in Act 1, Scene 7, and is this a dagger in Act 2, Macbeth is very, very hesitant and very unsure, quite conflicted about what he should do. And in fact, Act 1, Scene 7, he decides, he changes his mind throughout the soliloquy. This speech, it's the opposite. In fact, he builds himself up and becomes very much autonomous as far as, I'm choosing to do this. This is my reason. And this process is something we see getting carried through. So if you were going to talk about two key speeches, and you wanted to pick two soliloquies, looking at the comparison between the two and looking at the development or how Macbeth changed or what you can see that's different, that's a really nice way to build up the sophistication of your answer. So the arrivals at the start of the speech and the fact that this is a soliloquy at the end is the two important structural features that you may well want to mention if you're talking about the speech. The third thing is the sections. So I've just color-coded these sections. I've left to be thus is nothing but to be safely thus at the start, and it's well worth talking about that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You guys did this in Much Ado About Nothing when you had your assessment for Benedict's speech. We looked at the different sections. It's quite common in these long speeches for these speeches to have different sections. You can see that the first one's only 2 sentences long, the second one's just the 1 sentence, and the third is pretty much another just long sentence with a list in it. And the reason why I've divided into 3 there is we can see the development of Macbeth and his thinking and his psychology as we go through these 3 sections. So the first one is very much about who he fears and why he fears Banquo. The second one is a recap, I think partly for the audience's benefit, but also for Macbeth himself. He's thinking back to Act 1, Scene 3 when the witches appeared. He's thinking about the prediction there. He's very much concerned about what he's got from this and what Banquo's received as well. And then finally, it's a frenzy. It's craziness. It's lots of anger and aggression. We can see the exclamation. We'll talk about the punctuation later, but you can see the exclamation marks building up and the list and the repetition. And if you're an actor delivering this part, those were some cues to you to recognize how the tempo and the emotional currency of the speech is really developing as we go through these different sections. So that's the overarching structure. I thought the other thing that I'd mention before we start looking at sort of a line by line of two of these three sections is the overarching technique of the pronouns. I think the pronouns are really the star of the speech, and if you wanted to analyse the speech, it's absolutely a thing you should look at. If you think about a soliloquy in Act 2, Scene 1, is this the dagger which I see before me? The imagery is a massive, massive part of that speech. So it'd be very difficult to analyse that speech effectively and look at what it has to say without focusing on the imagery. This speech, I think it is the pronouns. So if we look at, for example, the use of the royal we, the our, the plural pronoun there, that's a common feature of royalty, still used today, and with that use of that pronoun comes a stress on the authority. This isn't just Macbeth talking, this is the king talking, this is the throne, this is the nation. Massive sense of authority and power there. And we see that it starts off with this way, and then it will just, Macbeth forgets to use it. And we really see the extent to which Macbeth isn't necessarily fulfilling the role of a true king, and also the fact that his tension and focus is not there. Sorry, the tension's growing. He's not focused. He's panicking. He's becoming a little bit obsessed, and really works himself up. So as the speech progresses, that tension does increase and that stress increases. If you think about this question with conflict and many other questions, that pronoun is something that you could definitely mention, and it's an easy quote to remember: "Our fears and Banquo stick deep." I've just looked at the first section there with how many he and his and I and my there are. So the third person pronoun with the he, obviously referring to Banquo, and a significant contrast. In fact, perfectly balanced. There's pretty much the perfect number of he and his to the I's and my's. So just as much as he's talking about Banquo, he's also talking about himself. And I think that really illustrates the extent to which he's very jealous and very obsessed, and his obsession with Banquo is reflecting on his own insecurities. So certainly something to talk about. Going through the next two sections, we see again how significant the pronouns are in setting up this language of comparison and jealousy. So something that you could quite comfortably argue here as far as tension and anxiety and stress and this discomfort with this new role and being king, and also the damaging effect of the witches and divine justice as these pronouns. So probably how I'd approach this is I'd memorize a couple of quotes that you could use as a representative of the speech as a whole. An activity that I think would be really beneficial is if you pause this slideshow and look at the pronouns, color code them, all of the he's and the his and the thems, everything referring to Banquo, highlight into one color. All the other pronouns referring to Macbeth himself, highlight in another color, and you'll see just how balanced the speech is and how much it goes back and forth. What's a quote you could use? You could probably say something like, prophet like they hailed him to a father to a line of kings, next to upon my head they placed a fruitless crown. So along with the pronouns, we've also got the imagery, but the pronouns really carry that comparison. So by remembering that one kind of pair of phrases, it's a nice effective way of arguing about how jealous Macbeth is and how he's really comparing Banquo to himself. And if we look down the third section, and we will look at this in a little bit more detail, we literally get a list, just phrase after phrase after phrase, just broken up with those semicolons there, when he's talking about them, Banquo's children, and himself, and massive comparison there to the future that Banquo has and Macbeth. Banquo is not a person who's scheming. He's not a person who Macbeth really should feel threatened by. And we've seen that already in the way Banquo's behaved in a really honourable way. What he said about the witches in Act 1, Scene 3, about the agents of evil trying to win you over and how they can really trick you. in Act 2, Scene 1, just before Macbeth sees the dagger, Banquo says, yeah, I'm willing to help you in anything as long as I don't lose my honour. And of course, we did hear about Banquo's fears at the beginning of Act 3. But in many ways, Banquo is, before he dies, afterwards it's Macduff is a great comparison to Macbeth. At this stage, Banquo is the perfect comparison to Macbeth because he has a prediction that's greater than Macbeth, but he's not willing to take fate into his own hands. He acts honourably and Macbeth doesn't. So as a foil, as a comparison, Banquo's brilliant, and that really gets crystallised in this speech. So yeah, those three structural features, the arrivals at the start and the end, the fact that this is a soliloquy and the fact that this is broken very neatly into these sections, and also the use of the pronouns throughout the speech and the structure and the way these sentences are put together. Parallels is a word you can use a lot as you analyse the speech. We know parallelisms and parallel language and parallel images are key in this text, and that's something that you could start to mention. What does all this do? It does structurally create a sense of stress and anger and anxiety and frenzy there, and that will increase as the speech progresses. So just those points on the right hand side, I won't read them through, but clearly there we get a sense that Macbeth is very much working himself up. So if we look at the question that we will be looking at later, conflict, or any tension question, or any disturbia questions, or unnatural questions, and prediction, all of these questions that we're seeing in the practice exams, very relevant to the speech. This is why these speeches, these 5 speeches, are so useful to you, because they can really be used to show a full range of the themes in this text, because they're a moment where Shakespeare's saying, look, this is where our character's at the moment, this is what he's thinking, and this is how he's progressing and working, this flaw is really working its way out in what he has to say and how he's acting. So just be aware of these things. And again, I've mentioned there down the bottom that this is the opposite to previous speeches. So, for example, if you wanted to talk about 2 speeches only in your essay, showing the way that this Macbeth changed, how he's developed, and how Shakespeare's shown language to show this in relation to the theme, of course, that would really show a sophisticated understanding of this text. So, just looking at the impact of the structure, sentence, punctuation, and pronouns, this is not an essay where you have to be talking about language features explicitly all the time. That's what you do in the first essay. This one is showing a sophisticated understanding of the ideas. So as you talk about the structure, and absolutely you should mention these things, do make sure that you are talking about their impact in terms of the ideas. So if you think of conflict, look at those words on the right hand side. So psychology, so that we see the conflict in Macbeth's psychology. We get a sense of the growing jealousy that Macbeth's experiencing. There's a massive contrast and conflict between Banquo and Macbeth. There's serious anger coming through, rage coming through, particularly at the end there. We've got a strong sense of the discontent, especially in the final scene, but also at the very opening of the speech as well. Desperation, and again, your vocab should really be echoing these things in your essays. Don't just say conflict, 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 conflict through your whole essay. Use these words. Talk about what kind of conflict this is. And it's interesting that rather than looking at, for example, a lot of people will be tempted to talk about the conflict between Macduff and Macbeth, or maybe Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, this open conflict in terms of opposing views. No. Sometimes it's much more simple and more easy, and actually, in some ways, more sophisticated to discuss inner conflict between a character, their own ambitions, their own fears, and what's going on around them. So just bear that in mind as you plan and prep your essays. And of course, don't forget also, where is this conflict coming from? Well, it's coming from the witches. It's coming from their prophecy. So I wouldn't want you to, in your essay, to say, well, if this hadn't happened, then this wouldn't happen. But just as far as the root cause of this disturbed sense of what's happening, it's what the witches said. It's what the witches said to Banquo. It's what they said to him. He's got everything he wants, but he's clearly not satisfied. And of course, don't forget, we always need to be bearing in mind context. So this is not how a king behaves. We know who a king is. We know a king's chosen by God. We know a king's all-powerful and a king's children inherit the throne, because there was such a focus on the genetic special superpower of a king. God's going to choose who their children is. God's going to make these children. God's going to bring these children up and make them be. And this is something that audiences are very aware of. And of course, Macbeth's getting what he deserves, isn't he? Because he trusted the witches and he's acted on the witches' advice. He's also killed the king, so we can't expect him to be happy and comfortable. Imagine Shakespeare writing a play for a king where a character kills a king and is completely happy and comfortable about it. And of course, we get that divine punishment. You go against God, you upset the natural order of things, and this is what happens to you. You can never be safe, you can never be comfortable. We'll start going through the first section and look at a line by line, particularly at the language and in terms of what we can get from it. And the first thing is this opening sentence, which is extremely interesting. Let's not forget, this is the first time Macbeth speaks to us after he's become king. He looks different. He has a crown on, he has his robes on, and finally he's sharing with us what he has to think. He's not putting on a show for anyone, his wife or any of the attendants or any people that are loyal to him. And the first thing he says is, to be thus is nothing. And follows that up with, but to be safely thus. Extremely interesting phrase, very easy to remember. And as far as capturing Macbeth's sense of conflict in this situation and sense of unease in his current situation, it's a great way to begin any analysis. Just looking at the structure of the sentence, the repetition of the thus there sets up a comparison and a parallel. He's got one thus, one like this, and then he's got another like this, and they are contrasted. The first one is nothing. The second one is implied that it's better, and the thing that's better about it is that it's safe. And what I've done there is just look at the two thuses. The first thus has the adjective nothing attached to it. Again, heavy irony that us as an audience can see that he doesn't have nothing. He's got a crown. He's got everything that he's wanted since almost the beginning of the play. But he's calling it nothing. And a sense of discontent there comes through very clearly with that adjective, nothing. It's followed up by the oppositional conjunction but. So there is an option to change that thus, and what he's looking to do is to make it safe. That adverb safely is very interesting, because what it does is it does imply that he doesn't feel safe in his situation. The first thus, the thus is nothing, is not a situation that he feels safe with, and of course that's what he's got to do. And it does tend to point towards phrases and expressions that are used later on about Macbeth being safe and feeling safer in his situation. Moving on through the first section, there's a few things you might want to mention, and again most of these are quite easy to remember as we're analysing from memory. The first one is that phrase, our fears in Banquo stick deep. A metaphorical expression. Fears can't necessarily stick deep. The implication is it's sticking deep inside him, very much like a knife. So that image is very painful, it's very uncomfortable. And if we want to talk about conflict and the fact that Macbeth is not comfortable at all, referring to a knife sticking into him is a very effective way to show Macbeth's psychological trauma. And ironically, you could make the link there to Duncan's murder and Macbeth stabbing Duncan to death not long beforehand. What's the first thing he comments on about his fears in relation to Banquo? It's his royalty of nature, and we've got the reigns there as the verb use, so it's continuing that image. Again, Macbeth has got a crown on. He's a king, and the first thing he's worried about is Banquo's royal nature. Again, showing his insecurities in his position and his fear of what the witches have said to Banquo. If we look down the bottom, that box down the bottom, we get again another situation of a parallel sort of structure, we've got 3 references to bravery through a noun, a verb, and an adjective. In the green there, he dares, he has a dauntless temper, and his valour is what's being commented on. Compare that to 3 comments about Macbeth's fears. Again, setting up these 2 contrasting characters. And in Macbeth's mind, someone who is extremely threatened. We see a classical allusion, bottom right hand side box. Classical allusions are great to write about because all you need to do is quote the reference there, and you can very much expand on it. We can assume Shakespeare is assuming that his audience knows who these people are, and it has a way of expanding the speech and the ideas in the speech hugely. We had in Act 1, Scene 2, Bellona's bridegroom. We had the adage of the cat in Act 1, Scene 7 that Lady Macbeth uses. We have Tarquin's ravishing strides in Act 2, Scene 1. Shakespeare uses classical allusions quite a lot, and it does elevate the speech a little bit and connect it to sort of history, but it also expands the ideas and adds extra meaning. When Macbeth finishes his statement on the 3rd line there, "'Tis much he dares about Banquo." Again, we can really comment on that. I think that is an indication how delusional Macbeth is. He doesn't really have evidence to back up what he's saying, and this is someone Macbeth is extremely daring. He's shown he's willing to do the worst possible act of killing the king on the advice or the truths, in inverted commas, told him by witches, and now he's complaining about what Banquo dares. So again, the added meaning that we can interpret from this gives this a sense of irony, and Macbeth doesn't realise, I think, what he's saying. He doesn't realise how silly what he's saying is. The fact that he's worried about Banquo when actually Macbeth is the one that's much, much, much more dangerous. Quotes and language features in the speech, and you know the main message of the speech and where the tension is in the speech, and I think that's what you're going to be doing over the next few months, getting to know certain sections of the text, being really comfortable with them. You can talk about them from memory. You've got quotes on hand, and you can really carefully choose which sections of the text you want to use to answer a question. That's fantastic. What we really want to work on now is being able to apply that in a paragraph situation and under timed conditions, because of course that is a massive part of what you need to do in the exam and what you're assessed on. So just looking at an exam question, a few things that we should probably pay attention to. The first one is this word importance. Every example the exam board's given us has got this word importance in it, and we can assume that that's going to be in your final exam. And it's a crucial word because you need to be plugged into that word as you're writing the answer. And also theme, the conflict in this case. So there'll be a theme part of this question. It is a theme question. It's not a character question. It's not a setting question. It's a theme question. Doesn't mean that you can't talk about characters and settings, but your essay needs to be orientated around the theme. That's what the assessment focus is for this essay. Here's a plan. It's not the only way to plan this essay, but I just thought we'd think about the concept of the importance of conflict. Where does the conflict come up in the scene, and why is it important? And I've just put 4 ways that I think this is important in the text. I think you should probably look at the verbs in these statements. So top left, it drives Macbeth to commit murder. So it forces him and encourages him to commit murder. That's what the conflict that we see in this scene does. It creates tension and resentment. It reveals how damaging the witch's prophecy was, and it illustrates how empty becoming king has become. So that is an understanding of the importance of a theme, rather than just looking at examples of where that theme comes up. So I think that's the difference. It's not just saying we see conflict here or we see conflict there. It's talking about, okay, it's there, but what does it do? How is it important? How does it affect us as an audience? How does it affect the characters in the text? How does it help things develop in the text? So that's the way we want to approach these themes. A few things that we can do to immediately make our essay or our paragraph writing a lot better, and we can avoid these sort of traps in writing about Shakespeare, are those things on the left-hand side. Don't do these things. They can really damage an essay, and we just want to just get out of the habit as we practice and as we prepare of doing these things. The first one is a major. Don't just restate, paraphrase, repeat quotes, or put quotes in your own words. It's great that you've remembered quotes, and a lot of people are focused on using these quotes. That's great, but rather than actually exploring them, analysing them, linking them to the themes, people tend to just use expressions like "this says," or "this is saying that," or "this shows." Even we want to avoid those phrases completely. So don't do that. Secondly, and of course you can look at your old essay exam papers and see if that's a problem that you have, and you should probably already know if that's a problem that you have. Don't just summarise the story any more than in a brief phrase or sentence. So we need to put speeches in context and put moments that we're discussing in context. So a little phrase or a sentence here and there is quite useful. But we don't just want to run through different sections of the story and talk about what happens. That's not what you're being assessed on, and it won't get you marks. And that's kind of tied to the third bullet point, which is don't just list moments where we see a theme. So in this case it's conflict. The temptation is just to go through moments in the text where we see conflict. What that tends to do is it turns into students thinking of a scene, talking about that scene, and then just summarising what happens in that scene and then going on to the next one. And they more or less have an essay which is 4 or 5 paragraphs with 4 or 5 moments where we see that theme. That's not what you need to do. That's not planning an essay. That's not making a point. So do avoid those things. On the right hand side, just 2 things that I think you can do that can again immediately get you more marks. We saw in that first bullet point, we saw in our lunchtime seminars, the students who are getting great marks in the exam papers are the students that show kind of a layered, deep, organic understanding of the ideas that they're writing about, whether it's a type of relationship in the poetry anthology or a sort of concept in Jekyll and Hyde. So they use synonyms, so they're not just saying conflict, 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 or this is important because, and repeating that over and over. They're using words like this is not important, it's crucial, this is significant, this is hugely important. For words like conflict, we saw a few slides ago how many types of conflict there are in this speech. There's jealousy, there's anxiety, there's insecurity, there is psychological sort of trauma, there's delusional statements. All of that is a form of conflict. All those are forms of conflict. And I think if you're thinking about the theme in this way, you're immediately going to have a more layered view and a more sophisticated answer. And it's actually going to give you more options when you're planning your essay. So people think conflict and they think, oh, that's got to be a battle or a fight. So you think of Act 1, Scene 2, where Macbeth is fighting off the army of traitors. Or you might think of the murder of Duncan in Act 2, Scene 2. But actually, no, if we look at psychological conflict and that sort of stress and anxiety, it opens you up to so many different speeches and sections of the text. Also choose a range of locations. I'm not going to tell you how many to choose or how many scenes to write about. I do think that you shouldn't be using more than 3 or 4, because what that does is it just thins out your analysis, and instead of just looking in depth at 1 or 2 sections, you end up looking at many sections, but in a really shallow way. That's not to say that as you look at your couple of sections that you can't connect to other statements or use quotes from other sections of the text, but the deep analysis is going to be focused on a couple of sections only. Here's an overall plan for the first 2 paragraphs. Both the paragraphs are about the passage that we've been having a look at. I'm going to do the first one, which is on the left there. Macbeth is in conflict with himself, and discuss why that's important, and deal with those things in the blue boxes there. And what I'll get you to do is the second part, Macbeth's jealousy of Banquo. So where do we see that, how are we showing it, and why is that important? So let's dive into it. The whole paragraph is about 9 sentences, and we'll talk about length and time in a moment. But I just thought I'd talk you through the paragraph, what I'm trying to do as I explore the theme and the importance of the theme. So let's read it. Macbeth's soliloquy in Act 3, Scene 1 reveals how disturbed and uncomfortable Macbeth is as he experiences a desperate conflict with himself. Now, just notice there in the opening sentence, I've used those synonyms for the word conflict. So we've got disturbed there, we've got uncomfortable, and I've used the adjective desperate. So that shows that I've immediately got a more sophisticated understanding of the idea. It's not just a throwaway connection to the question, which I know is very tempting in an exam. I'm actually engaging and trying to make a strong point about the conflict in the scene. Ironically, the anxious adjective speech is the first time audiences hear Macbeth's thoughts after he's achieved his goal of becoming king, a time we would assume for relaxation and celebration. So that statement's all about putting the speech in context and also acknowledging what the audiences would be thinking as they see the speech. So it's a nice way of introducing the speech and putting it where it is in the play. By using the structural device of the soliloquy, Shakespeare creates an intimate and honest moment between audience and speaker, where Macbeth reveals his fears, which stick deep. I was kind of aware here that I hadn't used a quote, and I want to show the marker that I know the speech really well. I've shown that I know what's going on in the text well, and I've shown that I can make strong statements about what happens in the speech, but I need to also show that I know the speech. So I've used that opening, or the second quote in the speech, our fears in Banquo stick deep. I probably could have mentioned here, this is a metaphor, so which metaphorically stick deep. Might also show that I've got a more sophisticated understanding of the speech. He feels he's achieved nothing, the adjective stressing how empty he feels, even as he wears a crown saying it. He's desperate to become safely thus, implying through his choice of language how insecure he feels in his new role. And again, let's just connect back to the question, which is about conflict. Now, the only 2 quotes I've used so far are to be thus is nothing, to be safely thus, and then our fears in Banquo stick deep. So just 2 quotes, but they're really helping me show a deep understanding of the text. Now, I hadn't mentioned a lot of context. I'd mentioned the audience, and I'd mentioned what they're thinking as they watch, and that is context. But I wanted to mention some of the big ideas as well, and if ever we're unsure about whether our marker will know we're using context away. But so Jacobean audiences fascinated to hear the personal thoughts of a king in full royal costume will recognise immediately that these are not the strong, authoritative words of a secure ruler, even though he's using the royal we when referring to himself. They would also recognise the impact of the witches' predictions have had. Macbeth has achieved everything he's hoped, but his treachery and blasphemy means that it's all worthless. Shakespeare has the murderers arrive immediately after the Act 3, Scene 1 soliloquy, drawing an extremely clear connection between his... Now, I know I'm getting to the end of the paragraph, and that's when I want to be tying back to the question. So I'd mention again the inner conflict and the worry, and of course the fact that that's leading to more murders. His stress leads to desperate actions, more murder, and more disturbed outcomes. And again, all those 3 things, a nice list of 3 there, all 3 are related to conflict. The other things that I could probably do to expand are tie-in quotes that I know from memory from elsewhere in the text. So in Act 1, Scene 7, when Lady Macbeth is convincing Macbeth to murder the king, she calls the crown the ornament of life. So would thou have that which thou esteemest the ornament of life? And that's a nice quote to show that Macbeth should be really happy. He's really received what he wants to receive. In Act 1, Scene 3, the two truths are told speech, he refers to the time when he's going to become king as the swelling act of the imperial theme. That's a nice play metaphor, and I could tie that in just as a subordinate clause in my statement to show, again, I've got an understanding of the whole play. And I could refer there to not just being thus, but being safely thus, to talk about how he wants to take action to be more safe. So if I was worried that I hadn't used enough quotes, I could just tie those in to my sentences. Again, just to remind you, this essay is not an AO2 essay. Essay 1 in this exam is an AO2 essay. That's how Shakespeare does something with language. AO1 is the main part of this essay, and that's about your style and your interpretation and how well you know the text. AO3 is the context, AO, and that's 5 of the 15 marks. So a quarter of the marks, sorry, 5 of the 20 marks, a quarter of the marks is going to be on knowing that context and connecting the context. From the mark scheme in the blue, those are the things that markers are looking for to give you those top marks. Can you just notice that the clear and convincing points is important? If you find at any point you're writing a paragraph and you've realized you're not making a point, or your point's not very clear, you're going to lose marks. Also, your quotes, if they're not quite, if they don't deserve to be there, if they're not actually being used properly, if they don't expand your point or make your point more insightful, that's a problem. And if your analysis is more about talking about the text or talking about a theme rather than analyzing the theme in the text in an insightful way, that's going to be a problem as well. So back to the plan, I've done the first two, well, the first bit, the first paragraph on the left, and I think I've done most of those things that I wanted to mention, and I'm going to leave the right hand side to you. So have a look at that plan, and I'll give you a starter for the paragraph, as I often do in class. But let's see if from memory you can make an argument about this. So what you want to show is that we see a lot of jealousy in the speech. That's the conflict that you're talking about, Macbeth's jealousy of Banquo. We need to talk about how we're shown this, and how this reveals how fixated and obsessed Macbeth is. Think about those synonyms: Macbeth's fixation, his obsession. They're all forms of conflict, and what that will lead him to do. So I've left lots of language features for you to talk about. See if you can do it from memory. Think about the metaphor at the opening stages of the text. This is all from section 1. The pronouns, the ironic royalty reference, the royalty of nature reigns, the contrasting references to bravery from Banquo, 3 of them, and 3 references to Macbeth's own fear. So tie all that back to that theme of the jealousy, and consider how they're important. And I think how they're important is that third point in the first box, what this leads him to do. So it really works Macbeth up to a frenzy, and it's going to lead him to commit murder. Here's the start to the paragraph if you need it, and you could probably pause the slideshow here, or stop the slideshow, write that down, and give yourself about 7 or 8 minutes to write a paragraph with several quotes and a deep understanding and explanation of how this jealousy is important, where we see it, and what we learn from it in the text. And then we'll go through the second part of the speech. So back to the speech. What I'll do is I'm going to go down to the orange bit, down the very bottom. The section in the middle is absolutely useful.
and it's got some brilliant imagery, as we mentioned before. My class spent a lesson actually drawing these images, choosing sort of 4 of them, and my hope was that by doing that they could really remember those images and think about the implications of those images. The fruitless crown, the barren scepter, the unlineal hand wrenching that barren scepter in the green there. And we've got 3 more brilliant images in the second half, so in the orange section. So I think we'll spend a little bit of time looking at those images, and that will bring us to the end. What we'll do after that is I'll give you a quick little plan again, and then get you to write another paragraph based around that final section. Let's talk about these 3 images. I think these images are really good for you to talk about, and they're quite a nice paragraph to write because you guys are very good at talking about images. You've been doing this for years. Thinking about the connotations of the words and the pictures and the visual aspect of the speech. To make a sophisticated paragraph, you need to connect the 3 images. So don't just talk about them independently, one after another. Talk about the overall impact and how they will build on each other and giving us a picture. Don't forget it's Macbeth talking about himself. He's the expert here. He knows what he's going through, and it shows us really how disturbed he is. Don't forget the punctuation and the structure. They come in a list, one after another, all in the same sentence. At the end we have our repetition to make them kings, the seed of Banquo kings. Strong statement, more tension, clearly more anger at the end of the sentence. And unless we weren't sure of that, in case we weren't sure of that, we have our exclamations to really stress the anger that's coming through. I filed my mind a really strong sense of friction, damage, pain. It's a gruesome image if you think about it, of psychology, of depression, anxiety, someone who's absolutely not at peace. Connect that to the rancors. Rancor is those words I've listed on the right. Hate, bitterness, malice, spite. Really strong sense of extreme anger. And the vessel of my peace, that's a cup that you drink out of. Again, that's an internal image, just like the mind is. And peace, I just mentioned it actually, peace is of course the opposite of what he's experiencing, a filed mind, and rancor is not peace. So his drink has been in some ways poisoned by this bitterness and malice that's crept in. Why? Because he's murdered Duncan. Mine eternal jewel, or my soul, given to the common enemy of man. Eternal jewel, a soul is something that goes beyond death, and Macbeth there is referring to the afterlife. A jewel, clearly something that's very precious, and the common enemy of man is referring to the devil. And that's if we talk about a soul being given to the devil, or a soul that's sold to the devil, we're talking about hell and eternal judgment. And if we put those together, Macbeth is very aware of the implications of what he's done, and he's absolutely in torment because of what he's done already at this early stage. So just looking at the bottom of the box there, impact, they build a vivid picture of psychological trauma, of guilt, of hell, of damnation. You can mention things like conscience when we talk about guilt, and all of that. If you think about our theme of conflict, they all connect to that theme absolutely brilliantly. So you can connect that to the gracious adjective that we see, to show us how he feels so guilty. So why does he feel guilty? Because he's murdered Duncan, and because Duncan was gracious. And that's another connection to the divine right of kings and the blasphemy of going against God. And you can also connect that to the eternal jewel image.
there's no point reading these through back to you in detail. You can do that for yourself. But if you wanted to talk about the major features as well as the imagery in this text, you could talk about the repetition that comes through, and think about the theme of conflict in relation to the repetition. So just look at my comments there. Frenzied, which is increasing, stress on the them, an angry tone, a sense of resentfulness that becomes more powerful. So all of that strongly relates to conflict. The top right, the seed of Banquo, I thought it was important. I would probably connect that seed of Banquo to the fruitless crown and the barren scepter, that imagery about a tree that just doesn't grow or produce anything, which is how he describes his own rule as king. And the seed of Banquo there, obviously the children of Banquo, but again, the power of a seed to grow and produce tree after tree after tree, with fruit and more seeds and so on. And also the image of a family tree, I think you could comment on there. The punctuation, bottom left, we mentioned a list earlier on, and this is in one sentence, and the list becomes more tense as we go through. We start off with that opening statement: for Banquo's issue have I filed my mind. For them, the gracious Duncan have I murdered. So both of those phrases start with the Banquo, and then finish with that's what I've done. This is the damage that's been caused. And then the third phrase starts with the damage, and then goes back to them, and then we start with the damage again, and then go back to them. And the them in the last phrase is repeated, so to make them kings. And again, he qualifies who that them are, the seed of Banquo. So we can see with that repetition at the end and the exclamation how angry Macbeth has become. I don't think he's that angry at the start of the speech. So while he's considering this, he's really working himself up. You can imagine the last time you were getting told off by a teacher. Sometimes they start to rant, or your parents maybe, and you can, but by the end of the rant, they're a lot more angry than they were at the start, because they're thinking and talking about what's happened, and they really work themselves up. I think that's what's going on in the speech. The structure, just like the speech starts with the murderers and ends with the murderers, this mini section starts with if it be so, if that's what's going to happen, and then rather than so. So he's placed the witch's prediction in front of himself and said, well, this is what's going to happen if this prediction occurs, but I'm not going to put up with that. I'm going to challenge fate. I'm going to take fate into my own hands. Champion me there at the end means fight me. So we get that a lot the more this play goes on, of Macbeth not being satisfied with the prediction, him actually challenging what that prediction will be. And here would be a plan which is based around the images and language. Of course, we need to talk about the importance of conflict. So what I've said there is conflict reveals guilt and damage caused by Duncan's murder. So this is the section of the speech where we see how broken Macbeth is mentally, psychologically, how angry he is, how he's talking about his eternal soul, not just here and now, I'm a little bit unhappy. It's a massive statement. And we could comment on these 4 things within that paragraph, and that's what I think you should do. Give yourself 7 to 10 minutes and make that statement at the beginning of the paragraph. And if you do this from memory, go through and comment on these sort of 4 aspects of the paragraph. To expand and deepen your paragraph, you might want to comment on why he's guilty. Again, divine right of kings, following the advice of witches. and going against nature and murdering a king. You might reference what happens next. We don't want to talk about plot summary, but you might want to mention that he's damaged, but that damage will lead him to create further damage. And in Act 3, Scene 4, we have a banquet scene where he's not just seeing a knife floating anymore, he's seeing the dead body of Banquo covered in gashes and wounds and blood, staring at him, shaking his head at him, and Macbeth at that point really tips over the edge, and he's never the same again. We could compare the speech to earlier on, the speeches of Macbeth that show how disturbed he is earlier on aren't as extreme as this. And yes, he's tense, yes, he's worried, but nowhere near as damaged as this. And I've just put 3 quotes here from later in the play. Well, one's earlier, Macbeth does sleep no more. Act 2, Scene 2, where Macbeth is talking about how he's murdered sleep and murdering Duncan. Now, sleep we know is a symbol for a peace of mind, for relaxation, for innocence, and that's gone, and we can see that echoed in Macbeth's speech here. Full of scorpions is my mind is what he says in Act 3, Scene 2, the next scene. He says that to Lady Macbeth, and another very vivid psychological image, which you could connect to the filed my mind image. And in the same speech, really powerful expression here that in some ways sums up better than anything Macbeth's torment, is the better to be with the dead whom we, to gain our peace, have sent to peace. Macbeth there envying Duncan and wishing he was Duncan, not the sort of expression that you'd use if you were at peace and comfortable. So if you think about the theme of conflict and what the conflict shows us, how it's important, all of those linked together. If you had time, going to the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech at the end of the play would be a nice paragraph to finish this essay on. Take 10 minutes and turn this brief little plan into a paragraph. Just to be really, really clear, let's go through a few of these questions that will come up. I know you might be thinking them already, or maybe you're beyond that. That's okay too. I think the first maybe 3 or 4 questions are all tied together, and they're orientated around the time. How much time have you got in the exam to write this essay? So I think that's a good starting point. This essay is 1 hour and 45 minutes. Sorry, this exam is 1 hour and 45 minutes. You have to write 3 essays. The first 2 essays are Shakespeare essays, and they're worth 20 marks each. So the first one's 20 marks, the second one's 20 marks. So this whole PowerPoint has been on a 20-mark essay. And that's one of 7 essays that you have to write in your literature exam. So let's just put that in context and factor that in as you're setting aside revision time. The third essay is 40 marks. That's your Inspector Calls essay. And the whole exam is 1 hour and 45 minutes. The way I'd divide that up is clearly the Inspector Calls essay should take up half of your time, and the Shakespeare essays should take up half of your time. But I'd give yourself a little bit more than that, because the first essay involves you reading an extract. So 1 hour 45 for the whole exam. I would give yourself 60 minutes for essay 1 and essay 2. And let's neatly divide that in half. If you wanted to, you could give yourself 35 minutes for the first essay and 25 for the next. For me, I'd probably break that into, I'd say, 30 minutes for the first and 30 minutes for the second. With that in mind, how long should my essay be? We don't care about word counts because it's all based around your 30 minutes. I think you should be writing for most of that time, as much as you can. And of course you need a plan as well. I think for the exemplars I've seen, 4 to 5 essays, 4 to 5 paragraphs would give you enough to show a deep understanding. We've seen 3 paragraph essays that would get top marks. So it's all relative, isn't it? It's how effective your analysis is. How many quotes to show that you've got a sophisticated understanding of the text and to connect your analysis to the text, I think you should be aiming for 3 to 4 quotes per paragraph. You saw from my example that you could turn 2 quotes into 3 or 4 quotes just by breaking them up and looking at specific words in detail. And you can use examples that show your knowledge of the text without using direct quotes as well. Time, we've mentioned about 30 minutes. How many scenes? We have talked about this. I think for me, I would use 2 to 3 scenes, but you could effectively do 1 scene. You could effectively do 2 scenes. If you wanted to go fewer rather than more, I think you should try and connect quotes from elsewhere in the text, just to show you haven't just studied one section, you know several. And hey, you know 5 speeches well, or you should know 5 speeches well, so how about you use 2 or 3 of them rather than just one, because you're not going to use them again probably. How much context? It's worth 1/4 of the marks. I think you need to mention context in every paragraph, at least 1 explicit sentence, but maybe develop each sentence. So each time you mention context, don't just repeat the same thing. Develop it, build it up to show you've got a deep understanding. And do I need to discuss language techniques? This is an English essay. I think absolutely you should. It should be natural. You shouldn't even think about it as you comment on quotes and what those quotes reveal. It's going to be the words in those quotes. It's going to be the structure that those quotes are laid out in that will help you analyze. It's not explicitly marked, but I think to show a sophisticated understanding of the speech, you need to be just talking about language techniques here.